In this session, we are going to be thinking about international collaboration and audience development. And I suppose that was the starting premise. We've got quite a lot of questions that we think we're interested in. My lovely panellists, who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, are going to talk through some of their projects, and then we're going to have a discussion in which we try to draw out some universal themes and so on. And actually, we would really like to have a conversation. So please feel free to put your questions and indeed your observations and experiences into the conversation. I'm Anne Torreggiani from the Audience Agency, and we've been working with a lot of organisations, a bit like ourselves over the past few years, thinking about how we support organisations to do their audience development and how we support them to do better audience engagement. What's been really thrilling for me is that as an agency that does quite a lot of working in organisations, strategy work, lots of audience research, lots of sort of collaborative projects and so on, it has been just a delight to work with other people who are struggling with the same things. Interestingly though, they're coming from incredibly different places. And I think while it's true that we have in the UK quite a developed idea about what audience development is, but it looks like how you do it well, and that's not necessarily been true in many of our partner, in the countries of our partner organisations. In another way, they don't have the same sense of orthodoxy and right and wrong, perhaps, that we do, and that has been very interesting, and I think that has greatly enriched our practice. However, what has been useful, I think, is for us to very specifically have a kind of clear frame to work within. I think even 5 years ago, there was much less consensus and understanding about what we mean by audience development, and I suppose this notion that we have our audiences as we are now, and we want to go on a journey. We want to go on a journey in terms of taking our regular, interested, engaged audiences with us and extend the range and nature of their engagement with us. And we also never want to stand still, and that there's a big sense that we want to be as inclusive as we can as organisations to try and reach out and involve as many people as possible, has become very much a kind of a common understanding. And that really helps us to collaborate, it seems to me, because we're all talking about the same thing. And I think that's only been recently that we can honestly say that. So on that background, I'm going to stop waffling on. That's our territory for the afternoon, if you like. That's what we're talking about. I think Ruth Mackenzie threw down the gauntlet to us a little bit earlier on and started talking about cultural democracy. I think there's a massive link between what we're doing in audience development and the notion of thinking more as facilitators of cultural democracy rather than as democratisers of our existing culture. So we'll be coming back to that theme for those of you who are interested in such a thing. And I'm going to start off, you know who everybody is, because it's behind us, and I'm going to start off by asking Clymene to talk a little bit about her work at ISIS Arts and as part of the Corners project.
Oh, well, I'll do that. Hello, everybody. I've got some pictures. Can you hear me? Do we need these, or can you hear us?
It helps.
It helps. Okay, great. Okay. I'm going to start off by just saying a little bit about what we do. I've got some pictures. We work in the visual arts. I found it very hard to talk without pictures. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our project Corners. Corners is a project with 11 partners across the continent in 10 different countries. We're working to create threads between organisations, between artists and between communities on the edge of Europe. So that's places where culture wouldn't normally have a front space, where artists aren't necessarily known to go, where tourists aren't necessarily known to go. These are our partners, from producers through to film festivals, through to capitals of culture. So it's a real mix of us. The projects, the Corners projects, were devised in order to create new audiences. The entire project was themed around that idea of how do we make our work relevant to the communities that we're working in, how do we engage the audiences, and how do the audiences become an integral part of the development of those programs. So really briefly, I want to talk about people, places, parachuting, and politics. They're all interlinked. So Corners, drawing threads between communities on the edge is what we do. I'm going to give examples of 3 quick projects. I thought I had a little longer at the beginning as my intro, so I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. The projects were devised. We have about 55 artists on this project, and the artists are taken on expeditions to meet the places that we're going to be working in. So the projects are then devised to draw these threads, to find something that links these different communities and these different artists from different places. The artists then, as co-productions, produce pieces of work which is then presented back in each place. Ruth this morning talked about local and universal are both important aspects of a successful project. So this is very much what we're trying to do. So projects which are site relevant rather than site specific, so that work in different places and can be adapted to those places. Quick examples then. So this is a project called Windows, which is a form of local democracy in action. So the artist, a dancer from the Basque Country, Michael Hanna from Northern Ireland and Valeria from Italy. Their project idea was they wanted to ask questions, or to rather to find the questions that those communities thought were interesting or they wanted to know the answers of. The very simple concept of it was that they would screen these questions within community settings, and the neighbourhoods would have red or green lights in their windows in order to vote on what they thought. A really simple idea. So the questions that they asked, there were some which were universal, so questions which were repeated in each country, and there were some that were very, very specific. So things like, do you feel safe? Do you think we should have more refugees? Other questions that we might have had, say, in Gdansk and Poland were around, very topical, around the power of the press and whether people believed in their local TV stations, whether around abortion and whether everyone should have access to abortion. So they were really quite political and gritty questions. But the questions were raised and were brought through a process of working at a very local level with members of the community to do that. Interspersed between the questions was a series of dance productions which again responded to individual questions. What the project then did was to reflect back what the answers were in different places, so that if you're in a small community somewhere in Blyth, in southeast Northumberland, for example, you would have some shared experience with somewhere in another community that might be quite similar somewhere else. The communities that we work in, or that we aim to work in, are these places that aren't the big capital cities. So in the UK, we very specifically decided to work in southeast Northumberland, in the northeast of England, and we're going to be working, or rather we are working, but presenting in the East Durham coalfields, again in the northeast of England. We were quite interested to frame this within the referendum conversation, so to go to places where the international or the European was something that was perhaps a little unknown. Ironically, places that actually receive some of the most European funding of any places in the UK, but also places that ultimately voted to leave the European Union. So our project, as well as having the conversations around the artworks, was also about generating conversations about our relationship with Europe, and that was a very important part of our process. I don't know how many minds we changed. I'd like to think perhaps we did one or two. They still voted out, but there was some effort that was made. Another project here, Voiceover, was working with local radio. So again, working with the local radio stations and with the digital online radio platform to ask the questions, to ask a different form of asking questions, to create radio shows about what was seemed to be important that again was shared with other parts of Europe. So reflecting these stories back and retelling these stories on these platforms that were there. I'll be quick. Oh My Home was a collaboration between a Swedish artist, a UK artist, and another artist from the Basque Country, and that was looking at the nature of homelessness and travel. So it was an installation and a performance with these three artists using these bags that are so familiar across the world for those that are moving from place to place, whether they're moving because they're homeless within their own country or they're moving as migrants. So the stories that they told and retold were the stories of people moving from place to place and why they moved. Little shot of it here in Blyth in southeast Northumberland. So this installation stayed there for some time, and the bags had little recordings of stories, the performance had stories, and the literature had the stories that could be shared between people who were homeless. Lovely little project that came out of that was this making little bags out of this fabric that was taken into the schools with soil in it, where the kids planted a bit of their homeland and took it somewhere else. And finally, this one, just thinking about this notion of parachuting. It's very easy to come in with we call them a big red ball. Come in with a big red ball, and we will say, "Oh, look at that! That's great." Really important to have big red balls and bits of spectacle. But actually, this notion of bringing something in where it doesn't have a relevance to the place is quite hard, particularly when you're working within communities that don't have access to the big red balls normally, and for whom something like this is quite a big piece of work. All of our projects engage really local agencies to create the projects. This project was devised from artists from communities where there had been conflict, so in Northern Ireland, in the Basque Country, and in the Balkans. The project was called Bridging the Silence, and it was looking at the stories that took you from the moment of conflict to the moment when you could speak to your neighbour. So it was a selection of stories and installation on a bridge, very simply. On a bridge, you cross the bridge with an audio program there, and you cross the stories and learnt the stories of bridging that silence. In the northeast of England, we didn't come from a place of conflict in that way, but the stories that they decided to work with domestic survivors of domestic abuse. So we worked with something like 8-10 months beforehand with the Northumberland Domestic Abuse Service to make sure that the artists weren't just coming there to grab content in an interesting way, but that actually it left something back in the community as well, and presented a space where the survivors of that abuse were connecting through this project to other similar projects around the country. Probably more than 5 minutes, and I might just leave it there.
They were lovely, so it was worth it.
Yeah.
not too bad. No, you're pretty good actually. Thank you. That's
Very
brilliant.
good.
Now, what I suggest we do is that that we hear from everybody, and then we'll try and pull out some common themes. But so if you have got a question that you're burning to ask Clymene, can I ask you just to write it down and hold it, and we'll have a chance afterwards. Now then, I'm going to suggest, so we mix it up, so it's not all arts girls and film boys, okay? I'm going to suggest that, Ian, are you happy to go next? Is that all right? Brilliant. Ian, tell us about Showroom.
Okay, well, my name's Ian Wild. I'm the Chief Executive of the Showroom Cinema in Sheffield, which is a 4-screen art cinema, if anyone doesn't know it. I thought I'd talk about my sort of engagement with Creative Europe and how some of the things that spin off from that impact on the work we do. I think, first of all, I'll say I've been working there for quite a long time. I was helped to get it off the ground. And one thing I always say at these things is we initially got some European funding to support the building of the cinema. I think it's really important to say that that cinema wouldn't be there without ERDF funding, which came from Europe. But we did get it open. Shortly after we opened, we joined an organisation called Europa Cinemas, and Maddie from Europa Cinemas was talking this morning. But for us, it was quite a transformational moment in that we were able to attend Europa Cinemas events, meetings, conferences, and for the first time start to talk to people from across Europe who were doing very similar work to us. And the result of that is we sort of realised that we weren't alone. There's a big network out there, and there were lots, and we made lots of contacts, and we put together lots of projects. But we learned from different people around Europe. We learned how to do things differently. We kind of learned that there was an accepted way of doing things. We tried different things, and I think that's, for me, one of the key benefits of the European networking that we do. It's been able to engage with different people from across the continent and beyond, and to learn how to do things differently. I mean, there's a whole long list of projects that we've done with European partners, which I'm not planning to run through. But one, I suppose I will mention, quite a memorable one, is when we worked with a group of, I think it was 10 kids from Sheffield, 10 from Denmark and 10 from Sweden. They all came to Sheffield for a week and put together a film project. They wrote the script and planned everything. They went off for a week at Central Studios in Denmark and made a short film. And then they all went off to the Malmö Children's Film Festival and showed the film to audiences and engaged in discussions with them. And that was kind of one of the most amazing sort of projects we've done over the years. We get lots of benefits from our European links. A lot of it is training and development. I know this is not about training, it's about audiences, but you know, we send our staff on training courses to learn how to be art cinema managers, and within that learn how to do audience development. Some have attended the innovation labs that Europa Cinemas run every year and come back full of ideas, full of contacts, and you know, you can almost sort of have to sit on them to stop them sort of running off into the community and doing lots and lots of things. We learn things. some of it doesn't sound particularly innovative, but I think it is in that you're doing it for the first time. So when we noticed in Sweden, for example, that the parent and baby screenings were really successful a few years ago, we started one in Sheffield. Suddenly that's really successful in Sheffield. We looked at how they developed cheap ticket offers for young people, and we developed our own version of that, which we launched about 3 or 4 months ago. We're currently signing just over 100 people up to a cheap ticket scheme each week. It's called Cine 26. It's for people who are under 27-year-old. They get a £4.50 cinema ticket. Every week the number of tickets that we sell through that scheme increases. We're now launching sign-ups into some of the more deprived bits of Sheffield where we don't traditionally have an audience base. And marvellously, we are starting to get audiences from bits of Sheffield who have never attended before. So those are kind of things we learn just from talking to European practitioners. You can talk to your British colleagues and learn a lot, but it just extends what you can do if you can just look beyond the UK and go a bit wider.
So I'm Joanne. I'm General Manager at Candoco Dance Company, which is a professional inclusive dance company of disabled and non-disabled dancers, and we've been around for about 26 years. Celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. You can look us up online. So I'm here representing 2 projects. We're a small partner on Unlabel, which is a 2-year multidisciplinary training and performance project for artists with and without disabilities. And we're also lead partner on Moving Beyond Inclusion, which is a 2-year programme of creative and professional exchanges, choreographic research, symposia, performances and skills development for people working in dance. And that's what I'm going to focus on. So if you've got any questions around Unlabel, I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards. So at the heart of MBI, we call it, is the fundamental belief that working inclusively produces more exciting, more excellent artistic work for audiences to enjoy. However, the mainstream art sector is far from truly representing the diversity of society at large. And opportunities for disabled artists to develop and present their work and for diverse artists to work together are still very limited. And so Moving Beyond Inclusion aims to address those issues by delivering 3 core strands of work. We've got skills development for creative individuals and the organisation's administrative teams. We've got the creation of excellent new work for international performance, and lastly, the comprehensive consideration of building audiences and broadening perceptions of inclusive arts practice. So by virtue of being a cooperation project with partners representing 6 different countries, we're reaching audiences beyond our own countries by default. And working across borders is essential to developing those audiences, especially when it comes to increasing the visibility of professional disabled artists and those working inclusively. So on building audiences, I have 2 main points. Firstly, and this is in the context of inclusive practice, the work needs to be excellent. I'll come on to why. And secondly, the work and its dissemination need to be accessible. So there's still a prevalent but mostly unfounded stereotype that inclusive practice signals work of a lesser quality. So for us as a partnership, building audiences goes hand in hand with broadening perceptions of what inclusive arts practice is and what dance can be. And the quality of the work, therefore, needs to be really high. There's already some great inclusive practice going on in Europe, but it's still such a struggle to get the work even seen by potential presenters, let alone then programmed on mainstream stages and in festivals. So it's vital that we build a greater understanding of our work among presenters and audiences, and that means engaging presenters as well as audiences in the creative process from the start. We actually have 2 partners as part of Moving Beyond Inclusion that are presenting partners, Orienta Occidente Festival in Italy and HIP, who deliver the Zagreb Dance Festival in Croatia. And their buy-in is essential. The need for quality is relevant for both live physical performance and for digital content, of course. And so we're creating insight videos featuring thought-out interviews with the artists, inviting audiences into the choreographic research process, for example. The content, the editing, the sound all need to be great. And there should also be consistency in that quality across the board throughout the partnership. And that's something we're still working on. And my second point with regard to building audiences is that the work and our dissemination of it need to be accessible. Because if we're aiming for dance artists to be representative of the diversity of society at large, then surely that goes for audiences too. As a company, Candoco is committed to learning, and we're constantly questioning our practice and discussing and debating all manner of things relating to dance and disability. And so we're also encouraging our MBI partners to also adopt a permanent state of curiosity, especially around developing the accessibility of our work. So as a partnership, we've been doing quite a bit of work on improving website access, for example, and there's still quite a lot of work to be done on that. And we'll also be doing work on developing audio description for our visual digital content. And part of our skills exchange has been around how to involve audio description as part of the actual creative process. And a final point to end on, it was one of the points in the blurb about this panel, was that we can safeguard and strengthen the collaborative way of working by ensuring all partners recognise the value of reaching diverse audiences. And for us as a partnership, that's where it's got to start. And without recognition of that value, that's where progress ends.
Hi, I'm Ian Wall. I work for an organisation called the Film Space, and previously worked for an organisation called Film Education, of which nothing more. So, working in Europe and international cooperation, I go back to 1991-92, I think it was, where we organised as Film Ed, I think the first ever gathering of organisations that weren't film institutes to discuss film literacy or film education. And if you like, the areas that we've worked in ever since then have been about film literacy. So under the Creative Europe Audience Development strand, we fit into the film literacy, and the projects fit into film literacy. So in 91-92 we had that first thing, funded by MediaSal, and then not a lot happened. Europa Cinemas came along and they started stressing the importance of education, which was incredibly useful in a European context. In 2001, the European Film Academy had a conference about the importance of film literacy. Mainly it was research. So every 11 years one of these things comes along and then nothing happens. And then in 2011, film education, along with the BFI and University of London Institute of Education, did a Europe-wide, funded by Creative Europe, a Europe-wide research project into what happens within film education as part of audience development across Europe. And we thought, oh God, you know, another 10 years, another research, what next? And then miraculously, this film literacy strand came along. And picking up on a word that Anne used earlier on, consensus. Did 27 countries agree what film education actually meant? So we got together and we produced this, which is a framework for film education. We thought if we're going to develop any other projects, it would be good if we were all singing from the same song sheet. And I can proudly say that 100% of us agree with 80% of what's in here. It's probably not the same 80% country to country to country. But it was a fascinating process and a real learning curve for all of us. The first thing we banned was anybody telling us what they did. You know, my project does this. Yeah, we'd all heard that. We all knew what we did. So we tried to work out why we did it and what outcomes we were looking for. And one of the key ones that's in there is making sure that children and young people are offered a more diverse range of filmic experiences. So we did that, and we wanted to move it on 2 years later to give some kind of ideas as to what this could look like, or how people had applied the framework to their work, but we didn't get funding for that. But then I got part of another project that came out of this, working with the Cineteca di Milano, University of Milan, Nerve Centre in Derry, and the Yugoslav Film Archive. And we're putting together an online-offline film literacy program using European films as exemplar, and that children will be able to work on that. The idea being, hopefully, they'll be able to see the kind of richness of what's there, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. Has any of this worked over the past 20 years? Well, I'll end on a statistic. Between 2007 and 2013, there was a 46% drop in European film viewing in the UK. And since then, there's been a further 20% drop from the figure after that 46% drop. In the Film Distributors Association's handbook this year, they describe European and world cinema as being in terminal decline. I don't believe that. I think there are ways in which we can change that. And I think cooperating with our European colleagues, taking their ideas, trying to get a forum in which we can discuss them in the UK, in the same way that they've taken ideas from us, offers some sort of hope. That's it.
I'm going to pick up on that as well, just to finish off really, and just to say, so I think our experiences of international collaboration around the promotion of effective audience development practice, which is essentially what we're about. I think there are lots of things, though, themes that you've all talked about that I think are really important. I think, for me, Clymene, this you know, I know this is about all of your work, but particularly one of the reasons you collaborate, but the notion of bringing together, you know, using the other, and this is an opportunity for us to kind of reflect a much wider world. You know, I think that that's a very important part of the work that we've realised, is that together, the agencies that we've been working with, I think, have to some extent developed a kind of campaigning outlook, which we may not have quite have come to on our own, I think, in the same way. But certainly that sort of European level, the notion, which I think was part of what you were saying, Joanne, you know, in a way you've used that network to campaign a little around sort of access and inclusivity. So I think we have, in terms of developing our own narrative around audience centricity, which is a very important kind of idea for us. And I think particularly in the European frame, audience centricity and the notion of cultural democracy is increasingly important. And I think we've taken succour from that, if you like, in the UK context, from these sort of European conversations that are happening around citizenship and rights to culture and so on. So a bit like you, we've just all contributed to a kind of a European study on audience development. I think 80% of it's probably all right. Yeah, I'm with you on that kind of thing. But actually, I want to get behind it because I think it's really important that we have that diet. We've got a framework within which to have that dialogue. So I think that's enormously important. So I would pick up, so there's a theme for me about ambition, a sense of the possible. I think you mentioned it as well, Ian, about this, you know, this just quietly learning from your peers and sort of taking things from very different contexts and thinking, well, if you can make that work there, we could make this work here, you know. So I think I've quite enjoyed the things that all of you have talked about, because I think actually what we've really got to are some of the benefits of what happens when you put lots of different people in the room and why that brings some value. I've got some questions that I'd like to put to everybody that are part of trying to pull out some themes, but I promised you all the opportunity to ask some questions yourself. Yeah, I'm enjoying that question actually, because if I had a, actually none of the projects that we've been working on are Creative Europe projects that in our network things. Our projects are all Erasmus projects actually, but we work on some of the Creative Europe projects quite often, doing some of the audience research aspects of it. And interestingly, I think Creative Europe doesn't ask for great, if we were just saying this earlier on, if they spent as much time and effort asking you to report on the quality and nature of your audits as they do on the quality and nature of the receipts that you have to hand over at the end of a project, we'd all be in a slightly better place. There's this massive bureaucracy around accounting, but we're counting, these ridiculous transparency things around did you buy a bottle of beer on that bill or not? It's mad. So I think, let's be honest though, getting the numbers right would be a good start. Just getting truthful numbers that are real and not made up would be a good start. But this is for our own UK practice. Obviously, it's important to know where, but it's also really, really important to know who, how often, all those things. And I think that there is we do need to encourage a commitment to really high quality quant and qual research in partnership, and to see a kind of confidence about which methodology is the right thing for the right project, which when I've looked across a number of different projects, we've done a little bit of work as part of that study. We did a little bit of work at looking at the nature of the applications that Creative Europe had in.
Well, I don't know the answer, but I'll tell you what we measure. So we do quite a lot of measuring for various funding bodies, but also for ourselves. So we do lots of audience surveys. We get people to fill in forms when they leave the cinema, particularly for one-off events. We also have a membership scheme, so we swipe cards, so we know lots of things about people, where they live, for example, postcodes, age, gender. The sorts of things we're measuring, so we measure BAME, like ethnic minorities, LGBT, postcodes, age, all these things we measure on a regular basis, so we have a very kind of clear map about who our audience is, and it tells us where the gaps are and where we perhaps need to think about doing more work. I don't know if we're measuring the right things, but we kind of do have quite a detailed profile of who comes.
A lot of our measuring is anecdotal. Of course, we collect all the audience figures that we need to, and we do the surveys that we're asked to do and all that. But a lot of it, in terms of Candoco's advocacy work, is anecdotal. So and said, sometimes you just got to go there. So we've always got a question around whether, as a company, an inclusive company, we will tour to a venue that isn't wheelchair accessible. And in so in the UK, we won't do that, because the UK has got accessible venues that we will choose above inaccessible venues. But in other countries where they don't have that access as much, it's an important statement for us to go there and raise awareness of access and inclusion. And we've been to countries where they've cut through marble staircases to put a ramp up for our dancers and for their audience members, and so things like that, where over a long time you see progress. And
I think one other key thing is, we always bandy numbers, which, as Anne says, we can believe or not believe, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's also the outcome. If we, in the past, ran a thing called Cine School, which was all European and world cinema, and it was great. We might get, in 15 locations around the UK, we might get 50 or 60,000 kids to that. It was free. The issue is, are they going to go back again? In Schools Film Week that we used to do, you get 700,000 kids there. Wonderful, whoopee-doo. Are they going to go back again? And what are they going to go back to see? And therefore, I don't think it's just a numbers game. I think you using the word value is vitally important. How can we develop and sustain, from our point of view, young audiences? And we've got to get young audiences through the door. Well, we haven't anymore, but it's a really important thing. How can we monitor that? How can we judge what experience they've had on their first, let's say, experience of something that isn't a Hollywood blockbuster? And what do we need to do to encourage them to come back again? There are things going on around the country. Ian was describing his discount card. There are all sorts of initiatives. My feeling, and yeah, I like cooperation, even though people say I don't, but I vaguely do, is with money getting less and less, there is still, after all this time, too much reinventing the wheel going on. Why don't you develop that in Newcastle, develop that in Exeter, swap it, do it, take it out. I think the BFI are looking for our 5 to 19 age group. They're looking at ways of taking out programs or offering ready-made programs for venues to pick up on.
That brings up an interesting question. If we're talking about measurement, and I think this, one of my favourite phrases to hang on to is, make sure you measure what you value. Don't value what's easily measured, kind of thing. Is the point, isn't it? That actually we end up doing the things that feels we've got to get up some metric, so we grab at something. So I think this notion of, really thinking what is important about what we're doing here, and let's measure that. However difficult that is, we've got to stick with what's important. And I think your point there is that actually, in a way, what I heard you talking about was working smarter, not harder, but getting more out of the money that there is. So something about what return on our investment would we get? Can we not be thinking, if we're cooperating, do we not think more about the economies of scale that we might actually manage to get? So I think that's an interesting point about, again, the relationship between money and bang for buck kind of thing. Sorry, Clymene, would you like to talk about measurement? Have you got something you'd like to? You would. So there's another facet to measurement.
I would actually. The whole sort of audience development movement in the UK is something that I frankly quite struggled with, and when we're working on the European level, I kind of feel it even more. It is about public money, and it is about the public purse shrinking, because the public money that we have for the arts, we have to account for it in a way that becomes harder and harder to account for. So our Corners project was supported by a strategic touring grant. We had to identify our audiences, identify our neighbourhoods, identify our segmented groups of whatever. So actually the Arts Council in effect designed our project through that application. Whereas working with colleagues in Europe, they also worked with lots of different people, but actually the decision of who to make it, to work with, wasn't made by the funder, because that's where the funding is in that area. I'm being slightly polarised here, but it's a much, much tighter hold on the who we should work with, in what way, for how much time, and where. And I do struggle with that. The things that we should be measuring, which of course is so much harder, we have a small example of a project. We work with the Roma community of the north of the east of Newcastle, western Newcastle, at a time when we had a huge influx of Roma people coming in who didn't have language, the English language. We brought over a filmmaker from Slovakia, Marek Sulik, and a photographer to work within that community with other artists from our region. One of the things we uncovered on our journey, this wasn't an indicator as we went in, was that the kids weren't going to school enough, and there was no collaboration between the teachers and the parents. A very natural outcome of that project was to say we will create parents' evenings outside of the school setting, and that naturally became a part of the process. We couldn't say that our next project, that would be an indicator of success, because of course it would be something else. So having the freedom to kind of make these journeys and be able to measure those things, which was an incredibly important outcome there. After that, the kids were coming to school, the parents were engaged and taking part in the school activity. We didn't really know at the beginning that that was going to happen. So I do worry really that we worry a little bit too much about identifying those baselines, particularly on projects like ours where we don't have a venue and we have no baseline to measure against, that we can trip over ourselves sometimes.
So I think I just get ready for the next question in a minute, because I'm going to shut that one down now. But just in response to that, I think in a way, I think we have to say that we're at the beginning of a journey where we say it matters that we know who our audiences are, that we know how they respond to what we do, that we know who our audiences could be because we're not reaching them. That does matter. But I think in our route to find that out, we're being a bit crude. On the other hand, and I completely I spend a lot of time worrying about that one. On the other hand, I think we are at least 10 years ahead. I mean, it's the thing that we most get often are kind of inviting to Europe to think about. Lots of wanting to fast track into that space without kind of going through the trials that we've gone into. So I think there's a real European issue, actually, if you want to reflect some things back to the British Council about taking the benefits of what we've learnt about being really careful to measure what you value and do it in the right way, so that you do focus on, leave room for unintended consequences. Do not create straitjackets of utter bureaucratic idiocy in some cases, about what people have been asked to do. I think we have almost, in the UK, we have a responsibility to do something about that. That's my pet project, and shut up about that one now, I've done it. Right, so, Alda.
It's something we've got to be very careful with, because a lot of people speak English, so it's very, very easy to presume that English is a common language, when for many people it's not. It's a third language, if indeed a language at all. All of our projects happen in the language of that country. So the slides that I showed you I showed them in English because I was showing an English-speaking audience. They would have been in Polish in Poland, or they would have been in Basque in San Sebastian. So the language is incredibly important because we're working at a very, very local level. If the work is being shown from somewhere else, it's in translation or it's with subtitles if it's a film. So that's always very much there. The one thing we didn't do, and the people that were fighting against it the most strangely was us, was all of the communication was done in English in terms of the website and the storyteller, the digital platform. And that was a decision that was made. We had to step back from that decision in the meeting and say, we're not comfortable with this because we are the English speakers and we cannot in any way feel that we have anything to do with promoting this as a language. And they all wanted to go for that because that was the common language, and the project didn't have enough money to have everything in translation in the communication, although a lot of it was in individual pockets. The other thing was, just finally, and a huge thing, the commissioned works themselves, part of the brief was that they had to work in different contexts and different languages. So it was a part of the production process and the commissioning process that we couldn't have something which was just single language based with the one narrative.
And I think it's easy for us as English partners to skip over that. I mean, I'm very aware of the fact that in kind of, we've done loads of amazing co-design. I mean, some of the most interesting co-designer programs and so on that I've ever done, partly because we're working across the sort of culture divides. But we have this massive advantage as being the English speakers in the room, however good the English of our colleagues is, that we have a very privileged and sort of dominating position in all of that. I think it's quite interesting.
Can I just share a language thing? Yeah. Now, there is a European English, which isn't an English, and if you put a Croatian and a Spaniard and a Bulgarian in a room and they speak English, they will speak to each other much more easily than they will if we're in the room full of our idioms and our strange perhaps we might maybe think about. I do have an idea, though, if we leave the European Union, that this English will go off on a journey completely without us. And we'll come back in 5 years' time and our children vote us in again and we won't understand anything.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, I suppose one of the advantages of working in film is films come in different languages, so you can easily organise events for different communities. And there's lots of examples of things we've done working with, say, the Kurdish community, where we've been able to show the Kurdish film, and that's brought quite a good audience for certain types of films if you're working with the right partners. We also do a lot of work with language teaching with local schools, so particularly European languages, bring parties of school kids in to learn languages or watch foreign language films, which is very successful locally.
I think in terms of, well, anecdotally again, yeah, by asking questions, and we will, at most of our performances, we hold post-show talks afterwards, where, much like this, audience members can ask questions, and our dancers and artistic directors will engage with those questions and give our perspective. That's how we do it. Yeah. but hopefully we can move on to a day where it's not a thing anymore.
Yes, there is.
Where it's, the natural state of things, where it's a natural context for us to be all together in the same room and people aren't excluded anymore.
There's a journey that we've taken in the UK since the 1990s, which has been on the whole very successful at releasing money for the development of the creative industries. And it's been a journey that's taken us through a very economic model of measuring our success. And it's the model that we've spread to Europe as well. The way we count it, the way we value it has happened. It's a journey that our European colleagues are perhaps starting a little later than us, but didn't see quite the importance of. Partly because there was a fundamental belief in the value of culture to enrich people's lives, that there was a value in citizenship, in people's well-being, in their basic and fundamental human rights. We somehow forgot about those agendas, and the agenda became economic for a very, very long time. The measurement process is based within that process of economic measuring, and we've now got to go backwards from it. Of course, the narrative now is about citizenship and human rights and an open and fair society, but I don't feel that the measuring process has quite caught up with that agenda.
I think this is the
Yeah.
crucial thing.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, actually, isn't it? Because I think again it comes back to measuring what you value. It's actually much, there are certain kinds of metrics. It's just, it's easier to do a head count than it is to count the heads and understand what the difference between the people in the room are, both in terms of attitude, kind of access, their kind of level of engagement, their level of how equal their original access was to what you're doing. So I think that's the point, isn't it? That actually, in some senses, it's both about the agenda, what you're measuring, why you're measuring, but it was also about what was easy to do. So I think the reason to measure is partly about saying this is public money and this is about public representation, and our notion of what that is has just become a lot more sophisticated, and we have to keep up to date with that in some way. So I was going to ask you, actually, all of you, a question that sort of relates in a sense to that, about whether I think there's quite a lot of research out there that if you just kind of list a kind of you ask lots of different people about what their view about what kinds of arts and cultural activities they want to do, and one of the adjectives they have the strongest reaction against is international. So there's a very strong reaction, particularly from people who are not particularly highly engaged, frequent attenders of the arts. Super engagers, people like most of the people in the room, are pretty enthusiastic consumers of international. In fact, it would be one of the top things they list. In fact, this word international is one of the big signifiers about whether you're in the camp of the sort of super engaged, arts-loving, whatever, the kind of people who actually, probably feel very confident to share their views and opinions about things, and or whether actually you're in a camp of people that go, I know that sort of stuff isn't largely for the likes of me. International will be one of these big words that puts people off. So I wanted to sort of ask you, really, it's a stupid polarity, clearly, but I'm going to just ask you, what's your senses? Should we get better, a bit like that lovely watershed example there at the minute, should we get much, much better at engaging the willing kind of thing, finding, there are an awful lot of them, we don't engage all of them anything like as often as we could do, or actually is the very notion of international collaboration, is it about reaching out and finding kind of broader audiences and finding different ways to use the difference that international collaboration can bring to create new forms of engagement, much wider relationships? It's a stupid either-or. But anyway, I asked you to think about it because I think in a way it reflects where we're poised around the promotion of the international. So I'm going to ask all of you for an answer to that as my finisher. You know who they are. If you had a question you didn't want to ask, we'll all be here in the break. Okay. Who wants to go first with that one?
I can't do either or questions. For me, it's
all right.
usually
You're not
both.
supposed to have it.
The answer is usually
You can do
both. But in terms of Candoco's work and performing to niche audiences, actually, if I give an example I gave you earlier of when Candoco performed at Steps Festival last year, and Steps Dance Festival is in Switzerland. Isabella Spieg is the programmer, and she programs a number of dance companies to tour around venues throughout Switzerland. It's a very niche audience. It's a dance audience. They know what they like. They will go every year. And Candoco she was struggling to get Candoco, to get the venues to take Candoco, knowing that we were an inclusive dance company, and they didn't really know our work and didn't trust the quality of it. And thanks to Isabella being a very forthright person, she insisted that actually Candoco would open the festival. And once the venue that was the opening venue had got us, the other venues followed suit, and there was an overwhelmingly positive response to the performances, and we were programmed at more festivals. So actually there is a value in going to niche audiences, when particularly when part of your work is advocacy around what you do. And of course for Candoco it's important to reach out to different audiences that wouldn't normally come to see dance work, even let alone inclusive work as well. So
quite an interesting story in there about there being gatekeepers, though, isn't there, between us and our audiences, which I think is particularly interesting. You go.
Okay, so for me, international translates as subtitled films, I guess, and we have some targets we try to achieve in showing subtitled films, foreign language films. It's just over 30% screenings a year. We kind of get a bit of money for doing that from Europa Cinemas, but we want to do it anyway because it's part of what we believe in. We think that if people don't see films from different cultures, then they won't be interested in films from different cultures. I think it's really important for cinemas like us to continue to show films from not only Europe but beyond Europe as well. We have some surprising successes. So over lunch we were talking about a film called The Eagle Huntress, which was a documentary released last Christmas, which was about a Kazakhstani girl who wants to become an eagle huntress, which was hugely successful with young audiences. It was subtitled. And another observation, I suppose, is one thing we did observe some time ago is that we were getting... Sheffield is an industrial city, there's lots of industrial deafness, and lots of people were coming to see films with subtitles because of hearing disability. I mean, that led us to another initiative where every Monday we show every film, English and foreign language films, with subtitles, and that has built up an audience as well. But I think I take the view that if there's a reticence to see films that you would term international, and maybe it's because people haven't been exposed to international in the right ways.
I'm sure people are going to disagree with this, but I think within
Take us into the coffee break.
Yeah, within the filmic world, we've got a problem. We believe that film is part of our cultural, entitlement. But I'm afraid to say that Truffaut probably got it right, that film culture and the UK don't go together as a concept. And we're trying our damnedest. When you start talking to the Department for Education, film is not really culture. There's culture, there's film. Various bodies, the BFI, British Council, it's part of the cultural offering. But out there, it's not. I would give you an either or. It's a film or it's a movie. And the vast majority of people go and see movies, not films. I think distribution has tried to get over that, and I'll end with an anecdote, if I may. For a lot of kind of world cinema that comes in now, there are quite often two versions of the trailer. One of which it's a subtitled movie, and the other one you haven't a clue because they don't have any language in it at all. It's all smiles or noises or whatever. And because then you're setting yourself up that when somebody thinks, oh, that looks quite good, probably because it is good, then they get there and it's a subtitled movie, they then go and complain and they want their money back because they've been, in their terms, they've been sold a pup. So I think changing attitudes towards film in general, from our point of view, film in general is immense. And it goes back, therefore, to what you were saying. Do we stick with what we've got and try to make it better, or do we try to go broader? I would always argue broader.
I think it's a very British question. I think this notion of international being something else or something other and us being something else isn't the reality of the world that we live in. I mean, especially in a venue like this, what does international mean? We've had these separate agendas in our cultural world between diversity and international. That's one agenda. And we keep these things separate. And why are we doing that? We have a younger generation whose lives are online, from the Pokemon playing 7-year-olds through to the festival going teenagers and beyond. They're part of one world. And we're increasingly hearing this exoticization, if that's even a word, of this notion of international, where it's just ordinary, it's just us, it's just what we're doing, but doing it somewhere else. And we have to be, it's our role to break this down. Nick Soroti yesterday spoke at the International Conference of the Creative Industries Federation. There's still this notion of them and us, this notion of exporting international or importing international. It's one world. Let's get on and live in it.
Oh, that's so good. I kind of really want to say, it's one world. Mine was going to be, let's ban the word international, but I was thinking, what do we replace it with? And we just think one world, don't think international. I like it. Anyway, listen, thank you all for coming and having that after lunch debate. If there's questions and things that you'd like to bring up with the panel, we're going down for coffee in a moment. Thank you all very much indeed.